We are so happy that you are here, and we are so happy that those of our friends who have joined us online are with us today. And we are so honored that Dr. Henderson has joined us. I don't need really to introduce him. I think most of us here know him well. But anyway, I'll take just a minute to say a couple of things. And we'll continue on, and we will invite him to the podium. Dr. Henderson, many of us know him many different ways. We know him as a true brother. We know him as a mentor. We know him as someone whom we dearly cherish and love, and many more. And so, again, we are so grateful that he has come and joined us today. On the professional side and on his personal life, he has dedicated himself to serving humanity. In the early 80s, without him knowing, surprisingly, he was elected to the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States, and later, shortly thereafter, was elected as its Secretary General. At that time, he was in Atlanta, and he was a principal in an undertaking, earlier stage undertaking, Air Atlanta. But anyway, that election and that position required him to move to Illinois, to Wilmette, Illinois, and required that he would give up all that he had started. Him and his family, who should also be recognized here, did not hesitate to give up and immediately take the step and moving to Wilmette, Illinois, and he served at this as the Secretary General of the National Assembly of the United States for years, and he is now still a member of that body. He has participated in numerous undertakings on a global scale, both professionally and personally. And with that introduction, I can go on and on and on and on. Let us just embrace him, and let me not take his time. Let me give him the podium, because we love to hear his remarks and his thoughts. Bob, we really welcome you here, and please join us and let us embrace you and welcome you.
Well, good morning. First of all, I would like to thank my brother Jamshid Ashurian, whom I've known and had the pleasure of working with for many, many years. And you know, one of the benefits of turning your heart to the oneness of humanity and to the service of humanity is that you meet wonderful people who become your brothers and sisters. And there is a Bahai phrase that describes the special relationship that exists among these friends. It's called bonds and ties that are stronger than blood. They are the unity of the hearts, which cannot ever be separated. And that is my brother Jamshid. I also want to thank Lisa and Tim. That was really beautiful. And it's a wonderful way to start this Sunday. But friends, I can't begin to make comments without just a mention of the weather. Because I live in downtown Chicago. And I live right on the face of Lake Michigan, right downtown. So right about now, when you step out the door, it could be anything. It could be 3 degrees, and with the wind chill, the wind blowing at 25 or 30 miles an hour, it could be 15 below. And people knocked over. Now, when that happens, when it's 15 degrees in Chicago and the wind chill is 15 below or 10 below, nothing stops. Everything operates on time because everybody is clear that that's just the way it is, and we're all going to have to go on. However, here, that is a very different situation. Now, I drove in from about 100 miles northwest of here, and there were pockets of fog so thick that I couldn't see the cars in front of me. In fact, they all disappeared, and I was shocked when we came out of the fog and I discovered that I was surrounded by vehicles that I had no knowledge of. and the wind was blowing and the rain was coming down and so forth, and I thought to myself, you know, here I am in the middle of the winter. I've come from Chicago. It was 3 degrees when I left, and I was coming to sunny California, and I had these fantasies of sitting in California and just letting the sun pour over my face and just feeling a little warmth in my bones. But alas, it's not to be. I could be here for a while, and I'm not sure that any of those wishes and dreams would come true. But and I can see the effect that it has on you. You all become shut-ins. But nevertheless, we're so happy to be here and so happy to spend some time with you, especially on this subject. Now, one of the things that I've had the real privilege of doing was I was appointed a federal commissioner by the President of the United States on the Martin Luther King Federal Holiday Commission. And that was the commission that brought the holiday into being. And so there was years of planning and organization and thinking about what this holiday would signify in the American observance. What message do we want to send to the people of this country and to the people around the world in order to celebrate the contribution that Martin Luther King made to the advancement of the American ideal? And the conclusion was that it would be a celebration of our service to each other. That the primary point here is that we are rewriting what it means to be a human being. And we are rewriting the links that connect us, that are no longer to be defined by race or by nationality or by religion, that will come to be defined by those bonds and ties that are stronger than blood, those bonds of the Spirit that recognize that we are all the children of the same loving Father, that He loves us all, that He inspires us all, regardless of our race, of our religion, of our nationality, and that we are created to know and to worship God and to advance civilization in service of one another. And so we took that spirit and infused it, quite rightly, I think, into the spirit of the King holiday. And I just want to reflect for a moment on the vision from the podium of the very first observance. Right there in Atlanta, in front of Dr. King's church, there was a stage built right in the street. And when we came on the stage to greet all of the friends who had come from all over the world and all over the United States, there were 500,000 people gathered in the streets. And it was a dense scrum of people, so densely packed that all you could see for a distance in front of you was row after row of people of every color, every race, every nationality, and every religion. And it was an overpowering spirit. And you know that they had come there with an expectation. And the expectation went beyond the celebration of one man's life and one man's contribution, regardless of how heroic. They had come there with the expectation that they would celebrate the ideal for which he lived, served, and died. That ideal of bringing our hearts into true harmony. And I just thought about a passage from the Bible that set the expectation of what it would be like in the time of the end when God established the kingdom of heaven on earth. Because the Bible tells us that in that time, God speaks to us and He says, I will give you one heart, and I will put a new spirit within you. And I will write my law on your inward parts. And I will be with you, and I will be your father, and you will be my children. So what the Bible is saying to us is that the advancement of civilization will correspond with the transformation of what it means to be a human being, what it means to be a child of God, and what it means to be in society serving one another. that this transformation won't simply be brought about by technology or by the development of the community of nations, although these are critical components. The United Nations, the African Union, the European Union, all of these, the Association of South American Nations, all of these are critical components of a unifying world. But the basic component of that unifying world is the transformation of each one of us. Because the transformation of a society as a whole begins with the initiative and the change and the transformation of the individuals which compose society. So I wanted to take just a moment this morning, and I wanted to reflect on this journey of transformation that human beings have been involved in since the beginning of time. And I want to focus specifically on the establishment of the United States, the coming of humanity to America, and talk about what that might mean and how we might understand this continuous struggle that Dr. Martin Luther King helped us appreciate on a deeper level and championed the goodness of all people, the opportunity for all people, and the imperative of our working together to change society. What I wanted to suggest to you was that the civil rights movement that Martin Luther King championed really began in America with the Declaration of Independence in 1776, when the founders of this nation wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and possessed of certain inalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." This was a turning point in the history of humankind. Just think for a moment. Every civilization, every nation, every continent in the history of the world had slaves. There was not a single exception. In Africa, in South America, in Europe, in every place human beings lived, there were people who owned people. And there were laws that differentiated their human value. And yet we're coming to the United States, and a grand experiment is beginning. It is the beginning of the process of the emancipation of all people, the beginning of the establishment of a nation in which that would no longer be true. But as you know, change in a nation does not occur like flipping a pancake on a griddle. We decide that the pancake is cooked enough on one side, and so we flip it over, and now we're going to cook it on the other side. That's not how change occurs in society. It occurs slowly. It has stages of advancement. It has to rewrite law. It has to create new institutions. It has to develop policies. It has to change human beings so that the basic unit of society has to be transformed in order for the nation as a whole to act differently. And that is exactly what began with the Declaration of Independence in this country. And the whole of American history after that is a progressive learning of the challenges of freedom. What are the obligations? What are the principles? What are the sacrifices and what are the disciplines required from every individual in order to construct, sustain, and live in a free society in which all human beings are created equal and possessed of certain inalienable rights given by God of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So I want to suggest to you that civil rights began not in the mid-60s with the civil rights movement, but in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence. And I want to further suggest to you that the Civil War, which cost us 3% of the entire American population, over 850,000 people gave their lives in the Civil War. to galvanize this nation. And then was the civil rights movement advanced again in the 60s, when we rose up and said, there are still people in this country who are subject to a different law, who are less free than the standard this nation came to build. And now we come into the 21st century, and we realize more than ever before that not only are we still haunted by the specter of inequality, by the specter of social injustice, but that it is evident in the United States and it is evident in nations all over the country. So our work's not done. So let's begin to look at just a few of the components of what that transformation looks like at the level of the nation and at the set of obligations that individual human beings have in order to change society. And let's pay particular attention to one critical idea, and that is, we started with the Bible quote that when the kingdom of heaven comes, God will give us one heart, and he'll put a new spirit in us, and he'll write his law on the inner tablets of our hearts. So we will gradually learn our relationship to God, our relationship to one another, and our relationship to carry the principles of justice and equality and fairness, love and encouragement, into the function of society, that transformation. What we learn from all of the examples that I'll share with you today is that the major progress we've made as a nation and as a people has come from ordinary people who have done extraordinary things. So let's talk about some of those ordinary people who have done extraordinary things that have transformed this nation, that helped establish it, that helped secure it from division during the Civil War, that helped rewrite its laws and institutions during the great period of civil rights. And let's understand those chapters as a way of understanding what our obligations today might be and how we might further this process. During the American Revolution, there was great division about whether the colonists could establish the American nation. Remember that the Revolution was against the greatest military power on the globe, the British Empire. And here were the colonists in a set of colonies and roughly defined states who were struggling to establish a new nation and take this land and its wealth and its people out of the authority of the greatest military power on the planet. Now, the conditions were not that they were unified about this, because far from it. Many of the states hedged their bets. They pledged allegiance to Britain in case they won the revolution, and they paid attention to the Congressional Congress, which was fighting for independence. They withheld their taxes, so often the army of colonists that fought the British had no shoes. Now we're talking about fighting in the wintertime, where the British could track their troop movements because our soldiers would bind their feet in rags. And the cold and the snow would split the bottom of their feet open, and they would leave a trail of blood in the snow. And so that's how you could find where the colonists were fighting. What they ate were called fire cakes. That was flour and water, molded together on a stick and held over a fire. And when it was done enough, they would eat that, and that would be their sustenance. Often, they would end up hitting you with their rifle because they were out of bullets. They simply couldn't afford them. And yet they persevered with more men dying of smallpox and disease than from enemy bullets. What would make them fight on like that? And what would make so many Africans who had been brought to America by slaves join them? It was the prospect of freedom. The philosophers at that time said, we have it in our power to begin the world all over again. They said that the past was the textbook of tyranny, but the future can be the Bible of the free. George Washington himself said that the bosom of America was open to people of all races, all nations, all religions, so that we could make of this one nation and one people, a truly united nation. Ralph Waldo Emerson later wrote that if you spilled the blood, one drop of the blood of an American, you spilled the blood of the entire world, because this nation is made up of all people from all parts of the world. And it was that ideal that caused soldiers, often without bullets, certainly without food, certainly without shoes, to travel through the snow and fight the greatest military power on the face of the planet at that time for this ideal of freedom. Those were ordinary people doing extraordinary things. So I want to tell you about one battle and its aftermath. It was the Battle of Trenton, where one morning in the middle of the winter, they had fought this battle against the British and suffered heavy losses. And in order to regain momentum, because the Revolutionary Army was suffering blow after blow, loss after loss, Washington and his generals decided to march all night around the back of the British troops. That was a 15-mile forced march in the snow, in the dark, in the wintertime, with no boots, marching on fire cakes. They got behind the British troops at dawn, and they attacked early morning, with Washington himself leading the charge on his horse, no more than 80 feet from the firing line of the British. And it was so horrifying, because he was the glue that galvanized the Revolutionary Army, that the men were inspired to fight harder, and at the same time terrified that he was so close to the enemy that at any moment he would be shot and all would be lost. They won that day, and shortly thereafter, a message came to Washington in a meeting with his generals, with his senior officers. And it was the message of the British Empire's surrender and the victory of the revolutionary soldiers. And as Washington got the message, he realized that he simply couldn't see it, and he fumbled around and tried to read it, but he just couldn't read the words because his eyesight was failing. And he looked up at his soldiers and he said, "Gentlemen, I have grown old and blind in the service of my country." And then he found some spectacles and put them on and read the message of surrender of the British forces. My point to you is to emphasize what people were willing to do and to sacrifice in order to establish this nation. And not to say that anything about that time was perfect. You know, we adopted the national motto of E pluribus unum. Out of many people, we will forge one people. And then we also enshrined slavery in the Constitution. So this paradox was an advancement in our understanding of freedom, but it was hardly complete. On to the Civil War, when the country was about to be divided for political and economic reasons and for the cause of slavery. But as you know, slavery was not the initial It was not the initial main objective. The abolition of slavery was not the initial main objective of the Civil War. In fact, Abraham Lincoln, at the outset of the war, guaranteed that he would not free the slaves in the hope that it would maintain the unity of the states. But as the war went on, Lincoln himself said that although we began this war for political and economic reasons, Providence has led us to understand that what we are really asking ourselves, and this was his question at the Gettysburg Address, is can a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all human beings are created equal long endure? And so again, we are facing the challenge of reorienting the nations, reorienting our understanding of what it means to be free, reorienting our sense of the obligations of freedom for us individually. What do we do differently? Now here we had, as I said, 850,000 people dying in the Civil War. That was 3% of the entire population. Let me put that in perspective. If you added up World War I, World War II, the Vietnam War, the Korean War, the Iraq War, and the war in Afghanistan, and put them all together, and all the other wars that we've fought since, it would not equal the number of soldiers that died in the Civil War. It was that great a bloody expense, but what it did was it galvanized this nation in a way that it can never separate. And it emancipated the remainder of its citizens. But emancipation did not mean freedom, and it did not mean full participation in society. We are still learning that lesson, even through today. I just want to mention again a couple of ordinary people who did extraordinary things. And the reason that I want to keep going back to this theme is that it helps us understand why individual effort is so important, why what you think, how you feel, what you value, the principles that guide your life are so important. I want to recall Major Sullivan Ballou, who was a 32-year-old major in the Union Army. He had been raised an orphan. His parents had died early in his life, and he had a wife whom he loved dearly. Her name was Sarah. And on the Major Sullivan Ballou was white. He and Sarah had 2 children. And on the eve of the Battle of Bull Run, he wrote his wife a letter. And it was really a letter anticipating that they would lose that battle and that he would be a casualty. And he wanted her to know how he felt about her and how he felt about fighting for the Union. And so he wrote a very lengthy letter. I'm just going to recite 2 excerpts because I think they're touching and meaningful. He asks her to forgive his many faults and the many pains I have caused you. He said, how thoughtful, how thoughtless and foolish I have oftentimes been. He writes, how gladly I would wash out with my tears every little spot upon your unhappiness and struggle with all the misfortune of this world to shield you and my children from harm. And he writes, but oh Sarah, if the dead can come back to this earth and flit unseen around those they love, I shall always be near you. In the garish day and in the darkest night, amidst your happiest scenes and your gloomiest hours, always, always. And if there be a soft breeze upon your cheek, it shall be my breath. Or the cool air fans your throbbing temple, it shall be my spirit passing by. So here is the moment of truth. When a young man at 32 years old, with every reason to live, every reason to excuse himself, decides to fight for the emancipation of slaves and the unity of the nation at what he knows will be the expense of his own life, and a life of unhappiness and hardship for his wife and his two sons. He was an ordinary man who rose to do something so extraordinary that century and a half later, we read this letter to his wife, and we ourselves find that our hearts are filled with sympathy and admiration for a human being of true principle. I also want to tell you the story of Salmon Chase, who was at that time the governor of Illinois, and he became the Secretary of the Treasury for Abraham Lincoln. And he was in his governor's mansion not far from the only hotel in town when he heard a ruckus. And he could tell by the shouting that two black men had checked into the hotel as residents of the hotel, and a mob of whites had come to drag them out of the hotel and lynch them. And Salmon Chase heard this, and he came running out of his own house, his governor's mansion, and ran just a few blocks to the hotel, and he stood on the steps of the hotel by himself. And he said, "These people reside in this hotel under my protection, and anyone who wants them has to have me first." Now, this is the kind of extraordinary transformational leadership that we'd like a little bit more of today. We would love leaders who would not worry about the polls so much and start worrying about the people a whole lot more, and who saw themselves as servants of the people and not simply leaders of interests that benefit the people sometimes and benefit me a lot. But these are ordinary people who were seized with principle. And what it shows us is that gradually, slowly, these lessons of freedom, these lessons of putting equality and social justice and love for all people in our hearts were slowly penetrating the hearts of people. And they were willing to give their lives over the expanse of the history of this country at pivotal moments to change things. We come to civil rights and we see a renewal of that spirit all over the United States and all over the world. Where Martin Luther King arose and he said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." He said, we all are interwoven in a single garment of destiny. He said, what happens to one directly happens to everyone indirectly. Again, stressing this idea of oneness. And he redefined our relationship to each other, reminding us that life's most persistent and challenging question is not what am I doing to feather my own nest, what am I doing to enhance my own, but what am I doing for others? That this relationship is the primary characteristic of a just and advancing society. Well, what happened during the Civil Rights Movement was that we learned to desegregate the lunch counter and to desegregate schools and other institutions. In fact, I went to college because the federal government sued the states for discriminating against black college applicants. And it just so happened that they won that suit the year I was available to go to college. And so literally, I was among the first of African Americans to go to college, and I went to the University of Massachusetts, and just to kind of put you in the picture, 25,000 kids on campus. There were 110 black kids out of 25,000. And in those days, we would go through the courses during the week, but on the weekend, on Friday, the university chief of police would come and arrest as many black students as possible and hold them overnight in the university jail, charged with trespassing. And then when the weekend was over, they would let many of us out again to go back to class, and then on Friday, they would come looking for the black students again to arrest them. Now, this was in Amherst, Massachusetts, and yet still in the 70s, we had these kinds of challenges for a small group of 110 black kids who were scared to death and who would find themselves walking under dormitories, and people would drop bottles of Coca-Cola out of the dormitories, and they would explode around you. The kids were terrorized. And yet it was a critical point in which their courage and their persistence, their unwillingness to stop, allowed those to become the foundation of the small number of black people who had college degrees and could begin to open doors for other members of society. Well, today we read about 12-year-old kids who are playing with toy guns in a park and shot by police within 6 seconds of their arrival. We read about others who are victimized in so many ways. And I want to, just in conclusion, I want to make a few points about this. The first is that we have made tremendous progress in this country, but we clearly have a long way to go. There is a lot left to do in order to create equal opportunity for people so that people can have dignified work, so that they can live in clean and decent housing, so that they can have medical protection, so that their children can be educated. I'm reminded of a study that was done in New York, in Bedford-Stuyvesant, which is one of the poorest communities in New York City. And the researcher, a PhD from Columbia University, shared his conclusions, and one of the things that he said was that these poor people, most of whom were black and brown, had extraordinary American values of work. He said if there are 5 or 6 people in the family, 5 of them have jobs. And all of them are pooling their funds in order to allow the family to function. Now, they might be sweeping the floor or flipping burgers or pancakes or waiting at a restaurant, but everybody was doing what they could. At the same time, he said that when rent was deregulated, the percentage of income required to maintain your apartment went from 28% to 73%. And he said, how could an ordinary family survive, even though they're all working all day, every day, as many jobs as they can? And the larger question for us is, how do we as members of the community begin to address these inequities in society? Now, I don't want to sound totally gloomy. I also want to say this to you. We live in an age which is the most peaceful and the least violent in the history of the human species. There is a wonderful book on this subject called The Better Angels of Our Nature, written by a Harvard social psychologist named Steven Pinker. And he charts death by violence over the expanse of human history. And part of the irony of our current life is that even though every time we turn on TV, we find somebody's been shot, somebody's been stabbed, there's a war breaking out, there's a virus that's going to attack us, there's another terrorist incident. All those things are true, and all of that represents our unfinished business of transformation and change. But friends, it is also true that death by violence is down to the lowest levels it has ever been in the history of the human species. That we have not had a global war in over 60 years. It's called now the Long Peace. To give you just a sense of how much violence is down, during World War II, the number of deaths by violence was about 600 per 100,000, which is the standard measure. You know what it is today in the United States? It's less than 1 per 100,000. You know what it is in Mexico? Even with all the things that you hear about the cartels kidnapping people and so forth, it's just over 1 per 100,000. And it's not just terrorist violence or murder, it's every kind of violence there is. Violence against women, violence against children, terrorist violence, violence in war. All of it is down more than it has ever been. Pinker says, all but extinct. Our heightened sensitivity is owing to the fact that it's always in the news. But it invites us to take a close look at the unfinished business on our agenda of building a equitable and just society. So I want to close with a few examples of how that's being done. Jamshid and I have a shared project, and one of the members of that project, a young man named David Flores, has a community group. It's a part of his church, and it's called Adopt a Block. And what they do is they go systematically, and small groups of people from that church and from other churches and sometimes unaffiliated with the church adopt a block, and they serve a population. They tutor kids who are struggling in school. They help kids who've been kicked out of school get back into school. They have specific intervention and support programs for the homeless. And these aren't folks who've got a lot of money. These are just folks who want the community to prosper and do well. But block after block after block, they're beginning to re-inspire the warmth of hope, the sense that you're not alone, the sense that someone cares about you, the sense that someone will help you reconnect to society and stabilize your life. Jamshid mentioned at the beginning of this morning's gathering that the Baha'is have a systematic plan that spans the entire globe, in which every community in every country has core activities, systematic education in all of the religions for all of the kids in the neighborhoods. At the centers, the Baha'i centers, of course, but mostly informally organized in schools, in neighborhoods, in parks, and in places. Junior youth have a systematic program of service and study that invites them to think of themselves as leaders of humanity, as servants of all global society that helps them understand the relationship between their individual lives of service and the transformation of the entire world. Youth are invited to help their younger members of the community, the kids and the junior youth, and lift them up, and are invited to see themselves as not just the future leaders, but the current leaders of social advancement. And adults are invited systematically in programs and projects to engage in social action, to engage in social discourse like we're doing this morning, and to encourage people to join these programs of transformation and change, to develop programs of social and economic development, and to do this with the idea that we are working to transform the understanding of society, that we are all the children of one God. In the readings that were shared this morning, it was referred to as the principle of the oneness of humankind, that we are all the children of the same loving Father. So I wanted to conclude with this idea of what all this means and how it all changes society. We started with the notion that in the Bible it says that when the kingdom of heaven would be established on earth, God would give us one heart, and we would all share it. We would all feel as one. That He would infuse the spirit of oneness in us, and we would be radiant and resplendent and see one another differently and relate to one another differently. And that He would write His law on the inner tablets of our hearts. And so we would be personally, internally, and urgently concerned with living the right way, with doing the right thing to our fellows. Well, there is a beautiful tablet in the Bahai writings that gives us a sense of the blueprint for this kind of life. And the tablet begins by saying that we are all the fruits of one tree, the leaves of one branch. He said, it goes on to say that we should live for the upliftment and the encouragement and the sustaining of one another. It says that we should transform our hearts, because now is the time for us to make every stranger a friend, to put an end to foreignness and alienation, to offer a helping hand to our fallen oppressor, and to make every enemy an intimate brother or sister. The tablet goes on to say that the time has been in the past where the distinctions of wealth and power were the distinctions of life itself, where the ability to move people around or give direction or have authority over people was considered to be an exalted state of life. But the tablet goes on to say that the happiness and greatness, the rank and station, the pleasure and peace of a human being is no longer based on social power or material wealth, but on the scope of your learning, on the refinement of your character, on the ability to solve difficult problems, and on your service to others. And so the tablet invites us to think in terms of the spiritual purpose of our lives, not just the acquisition of material comfort, but the service of others as a reflection of the purpose for which God created all human beings. And it says that we should live our lives in a way that brings happiness and joy to the inmates of heaven, that we should not be concerned with the acquisition of things, but the use of our resources for the upliftment of others. So it invites us to be mothers and fathers to the orphans and uplifters of every victim of oppression, a treasury to the poor, a cure for the ailing. It admonishes us that when we engage in lives of service, we will often find ridicule and difficulty, but that we should react sincerely and kindly, and never be defined by that, but be defined by the openness of our hearts and the love that pours out of it and the service we do for others. And then it makes us a promise that is the ancient and abiding promise of all religions. And that is the idea that when we engage in these wonderful acts of service and love in recognition that this is the true purpose for which God created us, we will be the recipients of aid and assistance from the heavens above. And this tablet closes by saying that if we persevere in this task, we will banish the darkness of ignorance and pain and prejudice forever and ever, and establish that kingdom for which creation itself was established, the kingdom of heaven on earth. I'll close with this idea that was so beautifully and consistently repeated by Martin Luther King. He said that the issues of segregation and injustice are the issues of peace. And I would just commend to your consideration that the issues of peace have to do with the transformation of human spirit and character and the development of a lifestyle of service to others, and can be advanced by ordinary people who arise to do extraordinary things. Thank you so much.